Picture this. You're visiting a loved one in a long-term care facility, right? You fully expect them to be safe, comfortable, and well cared for. But during a routine visit, you notice something kind of alarming. There's this thick, dark, crusty black scab right on their heel. Now, if you ask the staff about it, you might be told, oh, it's just a normal part of getting older, or maybe they blame it on poor circulation or the body naturally slowing down. But is it, really? Or is that black scab actually a massive red flag, a sign of a silent, deeply devastating, and entirely preventable medical disaster?
Welcome to today's Explainer. Today we're taking an objective, deeply revealing look into the medical and legal realities of nursing home heel injuries. We're going to uncover what's actually happening beneath the skin, decode all that medical jargon, and look at the strict clinical standards that are supposed to prevent these life-altering injuries from ever happening in the first place.
Here's our quick roadmap for today. We'll start with the danger of heel Eschar. Then we'll cover the floating heels protocol, look at systemic neglect and common excuses, navigate Indiana legal claims, and finally, wrap up with some really crucial action steps for families. All right, let's jump straight into part 1, the danger of heel Eschar. To really understand why a heel ulcer is such a massive issue, you have to think about human anatomy for a second. The heel has virtually no subcutaneous fat or muscle tissue to act as padding. None. So, when a bedridden patient lies on their back, the weight of their entire lower leg concentrates directly onto that heel bone, the calcaneus. That tiny little surface area is incredibly vulnerable to pressure. And that exact, concentrated pressure leads to the formation of what medical professionals call Eschar. Now, Eschar is absolutely not just a common, harmless protective scab like you'd get from scraping your knee. It is a thick, black or dark brown leathery layer of dead, necrotic tissue. It forms when sustained pressure from a mattress literally collapses the tiny blood vessels that supply oxygen to the skin. The real, truly terrifying danger of Eschar is that it's classified as unstageable. It basically acts as a hardened roof that completely blocks a doctor's view, hiding a silent, actively destructive chamber of dying tissue and bacteria right underneath.
Unchecked pressure triggers a rapid four-step chain reaction, and it is pretty scary. Step 1 is ischemia. This is where pressure, often just barely exceeding 32 millimeters of mercury, starves the tissue of oxygen. Step 2 is a deep tissue injury. This is where fat and muscle literally decompose from the inside out. Step 3 brings us to necrotic eschar, where that dead tissue dehydrates and hardens into that black shell we just talked about. And finally, step 4 is osteomyelitis. Pathogenic bacteria penetrate deep into the wound bed and directly infect the heel bone itself. Because blood flow is often already restricted in elderly patients, their immune cells just can't fight it off. Ultimately, this leaves surgeons with absolutely no choice but to amputate below the knee.
Which brings us to part 2, the floating heels protocol. The most tragic part about these catastrophic injuries? They are entirely preventable if established medical standards are followed. Enter the gold standard of care, governed by the National Pressure Injury Advisory Panel, or NPIAP. They're the leading international authority on wound care. Their explicit, unambiguous directive to healthcare facilities is simple. Quote, for individuals at risk of pressure injuries, elevate the heels in such a way that they are fully free from the full body support surface. In the medical community, this life-saving protocol is universally known as floating heels. If a vulnerable resident's heel even slightly touches the bed sheets, the standard of care has been breached. Period. So, nursing staff must follow 3 very specific mechanical rules to execute this floating heels protocol safely and effectively. First up, complete offloading. There has to be a visible pocket of air beneath the heels. Second, proper weight distribution. The weight of the leg must be supported evenly along the calf to avoid just shifting that concentrated pressure onto the Achilles tendon. And third, strict avoidance of knee hyperextension. Elevating the leg incorrectly can actually compress veins or stretch nerves, which leads to permanent foot drop. Usually, doing this right requires specialized foam or gel-lined heel suspension boots.
Let's move on to part 3, systemic neglect and excuses.
Look, when basic preventative care fails, it's rarely just the fault of a single, well-meaning nurse. Almost always, it's a glaring symptom of corporate business practices that view residents as revenue units instead of, actual patients. Many of these facilities are owned by large corporate chains that intentionally understaff their buildings to maximize profit margins. When one single nursing assistant is forced to care for 30 or even 40 residents on a night shift, turning patients in floating heels becomes physically impossible. This forced triage nursing leads directly to 3 dangerous operational failures. 1. Skipped barefoot skin inspections. 2. Ghost charting, which is where overworked staff basically go on autopilot, checking boxes and digital health records, claiming heels were floated when they definitely weren't. And 3. Inventory deprivation. Corporate operators fail to purchase proper suspension boots, forcing the staff to use cheap, thin pillows that just compress down to absolutely nothing.
And when an amputation does happen, corporate legal teams get incredibly creative with their excuses. A favorite manipulation is arguing the wound was just inevitable because the patient had diabetes. But the medical and legal reality, specifically under Federal Regulation 42 CFR Section 483.25, is that diabetes legally requires an intensified preventative care plan. It elevates the duty of care, it doesn't excuse it. Another go-to excuse is labeling the wound a Kennedy terminal ulcer or KTU. But a true KTU is an unavoidable skin failure at the very end of life, usually showing up on the tailbone during multisystem organ failure. Slapping that KTU label on a slowly progressing heel wound in a diabetic patient who is otherwise up and about, that's just a clinical misclassification used to shift the blame away from the facility.
All right, Part 4. Navigating Indiana Legal Claims. If the absolute worst happens, seeking justice means navigating a highly complex and heavily defended legal system. For example, under the Indiana Medical Malpractice Act, you can't just take a nursing home straight to a judge or a jury. No way. You have to go through a very rigid pre-lawsuit screening process first. Step 1 is filing a formal complaint with the Indiana Department of Insurance. Step 2 involves submitting written evidence to a medical review panel, which is made up of 3 licensed healthcare providers and an attorney chairperson. Finally, Step 3 is waiting for this panel to issue an official opinion on whether the facility actually breached the standard of care. Because families can't even testify in person before this panel, the whole case rests entirely on physical and digital evidence. And this is exactly where forensic electronic health record, or EHR, data becomes absolutely vital. Legal teams will extract the digital audit trail to see the exact millisecond a nurse entered or deleted an entry. This can prove, for instance, if a chart was backdated to pretend heels were floated after an amputation was already scheduled. And listen, time is everything here. Indiana has a strict 2-year statute of limitations, and facilities routinely destroy internal shift logs and understaffing schedules shortly after these incidents happen, so waiting around to take action literally means losing your case-winning evidence.
Finally, let's wrap up with Part 5, Action Steps for Families. You definitely do not have to wait for a disaster to strike to demand standard of care compliance. Here are 4 literal, actionable steps you can take the next time you visit your loved one. First, conduct a barefoot inspection. Just take off their socks and gently feel the heel for bogginess, temperature changes, or localized pain. Second, perform the blanch test. If you see a red spot, gently press it with your finger. If it doesn't turn white and then red again, meaning it doesn't blanch, a pressure injury has already formed. Third, check for air light. Look under their feet in bed. If you can't see daylight or a clear air pocket beneath those heels, they are not properly floated. And finally, demand care plan compliance. Don't be afraid to ask the director of nursing to show you the specific written protocol for heel offloading in your loved one's chart.
When basic preventative care is ignored, the stakes are staggeringly high. 44%. That is the approximate 1-year mortality rate following major lower limb amputations for elderly residents. Think about that for a second. A below-the-knee amputation doesn't just remove a limb. It strips an elderly patient of their hard-earned independence, inflicts agonizing phantom limb pain, causes deep psychological trauma, and drastically reduces their overall life expectancy. We'll end today's explainer with this thought. A black scab on the heel is not a natural sign of aging. It is a blaring alarm bell. But now, armed with an understanding of heel Eschar, the floating heels protocol, and the corporate excuses they use to hide neglect, you actually have the power to audit your loved one's care. So the question is, will you remain vigilant to ensure their safety and dignity are always prioritized over a facility's bottom line? Keep asking those questions, keep checking those heels, and never ever be afraid to demand the standard of care they deserve.